Okay. Uh, right. Welcome along, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Jen Neller to you. Jen is currently at Manchester Metropolitan University. A little bit of Jan's background without going into too great a detail, because this is her show, not mine. Jen has a BA in anthropology to her credit, as well as an LLM in international human rights law. Her PhD covered stirring up hate offences in England and Wales. Jen has a particular interest in legislation around hate crime, and also has an interesting, according to a website, in looking at the myth of benevolent Britishness. Now that's very interesting, because that means I've got to maintain a stiff upper lip throughout this presentation. And in 2022, Jen published her book of Stirring Up Hatred, and in 2023, welcome Lee, good afternoon, and in 2023, I had the pleasure, along with Irene Zempi, who's in the room today, of being on the same platform as Jen at the British Society of Criminology conference in Preston, where we spoke about hate crime. So currently, Jen teaches law at the MMU, as I was saying earlier, and focuses on human rights. Today's talk is about critical hate studies. We don't hear very much about critical hate studies, which we believe is a hybrid of critical criminology and critical law studies. As a critical criminologist, I know that critical criminology criticizes almost everything: the state, corporations, criminology, criminologists, and probably everything that goes with it. So this would be a very interesting talk. So I'd ask you, please, out of respect to Jen, to leave any questions to the end. And now I've said enough. So Jen, it's over to you for your presentation, please, with questions to follow.
Thank you so much, David. So interesting to hear what you pulled together from the internet. I think there's so many different kind of profiles. It's always, I worry about what I've forgotten, I've written somewhere. Okay, so I actually wanted to start with a question for the audience. And this was just to give you a couple of minutes to think about what you think critical hate studies means, because I'm going to share with you some of my ideas on the topic, but you will all come from different backgrounds and perhaps be arriving at this session with your own ideas. Or maybe you've not thought much about it beyond kind of showing up here, which I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that you're all here. So if I could give you a couple of minutes to think, what does critical hate studies mean to you? What could it mean? And if you'd like to share your thoughts in chat, that would be wonderful. I'd be really interested to see where we are starting from today.
A couple of attendees are typing in the chat, and while they're doing so, can I perhaps add my question, which is, does it challenge previous incarnations of hate crime research and approaches, would be my question. If anyone prefers to come on the mic to ask your question, Jen, please do. All mics are allowable.
Yes, I'm trying really hard to do that awkward thing in teaching where you allow the silence.
I recently met a critical economist. I didn't ask.
Okay, some really interesting responses coming in here, which I think are reassuring to me because they're kind of things that I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about. So critical hate studies is going to mean different things to different people, depending on our background, depending on our interests. We're going to be interrogating diverse conceptions. I like Sarah's answer that it will involve an acknowledgement of the impact of neoliberalism, and that it will involve recognizing harms experienced by perpetrators as well as victims. I think that does kind of challenge the perhaps more traditional paradigm of criminal law, hate crime included in that. Different perspectives. We need to reflect on our own theories, our arguments, our assumptions, perhaps. Authoritarian and anti-authoritarian resistance to hate crime laws. And abolitionism. Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful for me to see what your thoughts are as we start here. And I think I'm probably not going to deliver any kind of paradigm shift here. I'm really going to be kind of building on the kinds of things that you've said. So I'm going to be looking at, first of all, what could critical hate studies mean? And thank you very much for your help with this first question. Then, are hate studies inherently critical? Are all the hate studies activities that we're doing in some way critical? And then I'm finally going to share some ideas about what critical hate studies should mean, what I think it should mean, why I think it might be useful to apply the label of critical to a specific type of hate studies. So in some respects, these questions arise from a personal quest to understand and formulate my own academic identity. So please forgive me for this indulgence. But I think they're also a response to a feeling that something already exists that has not been kind of fully articulated, and that articulating it would be helpful. So what I'm doing here is not really trying to forge something new, but rather to affix a title to something that I think has been happening for quite some time and that we could perhaps more clearly identify and develop. So, as noted in chat, I think how we answer the question of what critical hate studies is depends to quite some extent on who we are and what we're bringing to that question. So for me, I've mapped out here 4 fields that I kind of loosely fall within or a little bit between sometimes. So I probably feel most at home in hate studies. As David said, my PhD was on the stirring up hatred offences of England and Wales. Yet, because I was focusing on the construction of identities during the enactment of legislation, this didn't always seem to fit very neatly with the more kind of practice-focused vibe of hate studies. When kind of attending the International Network of Hate Studies conference, for example, there was kind of a small pocket of people doing similar things, but then a much wider kind of array of people with whom I didn't seem to be in direct conversation. And while hate studies is an interdisciplinary field, I think it's also perhaps most strongly grown and cultivated from within criminology departments. And this is perhaps where many of you, as members, or you've come here through the British Society of Criminology, many of you will kind of relate to this more strongly, I think. but I'm least at home here in criminology, because I've never had any kind of instruction in criminology. I've never done any teaching in criminology. But from attending criminology conferences, I've got a sense of the kind of breadth of criminology and the extent to which it encompasses very critical and then also much less critical, I think, approaches. And then for critical legal studies, I'm not a lawyer, but I have an LLM and I have a PhD in law, and I'm now working within a law department somehow. My PhD was at Birkbeck, which is a self-titled critical law school. So I have been quite immersed in critical legal theory. However, it's ironic that the first critical legal conference I attended had the theme of alienation, because I really felt that. There aren't so many people working on hate crime in this area. And I do struggle with the theory when it gets very abstract, very self-referential, and indeed, I think quite inaccessible and alienating for those of us with a closer eye on the lived experiences of victims, of perpetrators, of what's actually happening. Finally, then, socio-legal studies. I think this is perhaps the broadest and most diverse field. Criminologists among you may disagree with me there. And it kind of is supposed to encapsulate the overlap between law and sociology, but it seems to me to encompass a really wide range of more practice-focused theory. I've participated in several different streams at the Socio-Legal Studies Association conferences, including Law and Emotion, Equality and Human Rights, and Embodying Law. And there do seem to be several people doing hate studies who are moving in socio-legal circles, but as with criminology, some are doing it more critically, some are doing it less critically. So I've been a little bit nomadic in my search for a home for what I do. And what I'm interested in doing here is kind of perhaps creating a new meeting point in the overlap of these different disciplines, different fields, where people who are doing critical hate studies can more easily find one another and each other's work. So what do I mean by critical? I've used this term quite a bit already, as though we all know what it means, but I think different people from different disciplines mean different things by the term. And I've started to look at kind of different publications where people have used the word critical in relation to hate studies, and I am finding that it is used to mean very different things. So some different ideas on this. I'm going to talk to this slide for a long time, so don't worry, it's not stuck. So the critical is often closely connected to the theoretical, with critical branch of a discipline encompassing the application of a variety of critical theories to the topic. So this might be feminist theory, post-colonial or decolonial theory, Marxist theory, critical race theory, queer theory, intersectional theories, etc. However, I think that because hate studies kind of took shape as a discipline around the turn of the century, when such approaches were already well established, and because these questions of identity are inherent to the concept of hate crime, it's not clear that attention to these theories of power and oppression can usefully distinguish critical hate studies from more mainstream hate studies. I also think it's become apparent that critical theories such as feminism can be used for decidedly uncritical boundary policing sorts of purposes. So rather than suggesting that critical hate studies is simply hate studies that draws from one of these theories, another way of approaching it would be to define the critical in opposition to something orthodox. Now, we need to recognise that what's orthodox shifts over time, and that scholarship resisting the orthodox may also do so in a number of different ways. So perhaps instead of a binary approach, orthodox versus critical, we might think of a spectrum of criticality, which is what I'm attempting to map out here. And to be clear, this spectrum is not intended to be a hierarchy. I'm not suggesting that work at either end is more or less important. But rather, if the purpose of critical scholarship is broadly to challenge prevailing assumptions and power dynamics, proposing and applying a spectrum of criticality is an attempt to set out the tools that we have at our disposal for doing this. So I'm going to talk through each of these points on the spectrum, but I need to start by acknowledging that something is missing from this. There is, I think, kind of off the left-hand side, a particular strand of hate crime scholarship that sometimes labels itself as critical, because it is critical of the entire concept of hate crime law. I'm thinking here, for example, of Jacobs and Potter's book titled Hate Crimes, A Critical Perspective. Now, personally, I think that work is more of an uncritical rejection. Many of their points about the limitations and potential complicities of the law are valid, but they don't, in my view, take seriously the harms that are caused by hatred. And for me, I think this has to be our starting point. I think that critical hate studies has to start from the position that hatred in society is real, it's harmful, and it does, in some circumstances, necessitate a legal response. Okay, so that's what's kind of not included here. So I'll now focus on what is here. So first of all, we have redress. So this is a form of critique of a current situation that calls for some kind of redress. So for example, it describes critical race theory in the 1980s and efforts since then to get various forms of hatred to be recognised by the law. This notion that hatred requires redress is, I think, a level of criticality which forms the foundation of most endeavours in hate studies. I think this was a critical point, again, kind of around the turn of the century or in the 90s, when it was critical of the status quo to be advocating for hate crime law. Then we have reform, which could also be labelled internal critique. So nowadays, we're dealing with a system that has absorbed the initial calls for recognition and redress, a system that now includes hate crime laws. So the initial assertion that hate crime is a problem that requires redress could be seen as having been absorbed into the current orthodoxy. Now, critiques that point to unequal outcomes and the ongoing harms of hatred have become internal critiques. They're no longer calls for the system to do something, but calls for the system to respond more effectively, to do better. So calls for reform then are about highlighting contradictions within the system and looking for ways that the system can be adjusted to resolve them. So, for example, we might point to discrepancies and exclusions within hate crime law and seek to extend or amend the law in order to make it better align with what we understand to be its goals. In these ways, we seek to adapt the system to better the lives of whom it usually disadvantages and marginalises. And this is where I think a large amount of kind of contemporary hate studies sits. Many of us are doing brilliant work to try and improve the current system. Next, we have what I've called reflexivity. Now that the movement to redress hatred has become absorbed into the legal system, and this has been interrogated through internal critique and reforms, we come to reflexive critique. So this is where the discipline or field or movement turns its critical gaze inwards to question its own assumptions, its boundaries, its goals, its efficacy, and its effects. So here we find a number of debates that are familiar within hate studies, including whether hate is even the correct term for the problem that we're dealing with. As hate crime is a relatively recent concept and a relatively young and controversial legal phenomenon, little about it has been accepted as a given or taken for granted. And as a field, I think hate studies has emerged with a level of reflexivity and critical analysis of the object of its concern that for other older disciplines developed later in their life. But there are also perhaps different angles or different degrees of criticality within our disciplinary reflections. So questions about what do we mean by hate, or is bias crime a more accurate term, could be quite oriented towards reform of the current system. Other reflexive questions might lean more towards critical legal theory or critical criminology, such as how is the study of hate affected by the structures of power within which such studies are designed and conducted? Or what role do studies of hate have in transforming or affirming structures of power, punitive systems of criminal justice, or neoliberal doctrines of individualism? So we might think of reflexivity as similar to reform, except instead of attempting to reform law and policy directly, we're attempting to reform our discipline. Next, then we have rupture. And here I start to draw more from critical legal theory and specifically from some of the thinking of Emilius Christodoulidis. And as such, by rupture, I mean imminent critique, which is a critique that finds the current system to be problematic to an extent that reform is no longer a solution. So what is needed is rupture. And I think there are two main problems that give rise to rupture in hate studies. The first is the risk that in seeking to address certain problems, we end up affirming the system that produced them. So, for example, if we seek to address discrimination through the enactment of legislation asserting minority rights, a side effect of creating claimable rights is the reassertion of the otherness that produced the discrimination in the first place. So if the system within which those rights are to be claimed is not really altered, the ability to claim the rights is likely to be impeded by the same discrimination they are supposed to address. So the language of rights that was supposed to be emancipatory becomes absorbed and somewhat neutered by the system. And similarly, we see how the language of freedom gets co-opted to justify restrictions, the language of peace gets co-opted to justify violent pacification, etc. By being absorbed into the system, it becomes a tool that the unequal system will use to sustain itself and to pursue the same goals as it always has, goals which are ultimately rarely concerned with the suffering of minorities. I start to sound incredibly cynical here, I know, but I do, just to kind of plug the book a little bit, I do have the receipts for this in relation to the stirring up hatred offences, at least. So the first problem is that the system will co-opt languages and mechanisms of resistance. This leads to the somewhat complementary problem that advocacy of hate crime law or reforms is often seeking to co-opt the violence of the state. Some scholars have argued that it is self-defeating to seek legal redress for the kinds of violence that the law itself is complicit in. An example that springs to my mind is Dean Spade's critique of trans rights activism that seeks legal recognition, i.e., activism that turns for protection to the very system that has persecuted, brutalised and stigmatised trans bodies. To attain legal recognition in the form of hate crime legislation, then, Spade describes as little more than adjusting the window dressing of what remains a violent and exclusionary system. And if you're successful in attaining recognition and inclusion, is it really satisfactory to become a beneficiary instead of a target of that violence? So with rupture, we're not just seeking to tweak the system, to plug the gaps and smooth the kinks. Here we are pointing to ways in which the system is broken to an extent that cannot be repaired and still remain recognisable as the same system. What we're pointing to are what we might call functional contradictions. So the kinds of contradictions that paradoxically sustain the system. I've got a couple of examples here, but I think I'll rush over that. So where hate studies have entered into critiques of rupture, this has involved the implication of the system in the creation and dissemination of hatreds and discussion of how those hatreds serve to reproduce the inequalities and oppressions that characterize and sustain the system. Finally, then, we have the most radical end of the spectrum, which I've labelled reimagining. So this is where we go after rupture. Once we've found the current system to be untenable, there is work to be done to figure out what we need instead. So we could include prison abolition within this category, for example. And with regards to identities, which is where my research focuses, a key aspect of this form of critique is the rejection of a division between a core and periphery that defines inclusion as the assimilation of others into the core. Again, we might think of recognition politics as an example where the achievement of legal recognition of, as an example, we might think of recognition politics in relation to same-sex marriage. So the achievement of legal recognition of same-sex marriage assimilates homosexuality into structures of legally regulated monogamy, rather than more radically addressing social norms about proper sexual partnerships. And of course, there's the notion that I've found consistently within my own research that Black and Asian cultures must integrate seamlessly, must not be too separate, must not be too different, too questioning. So what do we imagine instead? Instead of assimilation or integration, which pretty much means the same thing in practice, we have the same ideas of who needs to integrate with whom. Radical critique instead requires a reimagining of constituent power, so that no one within the system is deemed more or less constituent of the system, of the population. So it's a reimagining of the rights and belonging that seeks to break free from the hierarchies of entitlement produced by borders, imprisonment, and many other forms of legal recognition and exclusion. Okay, so that's how I've pulled together different ideas of what it means to take a critical perspective. So I return to this question of whether hate studies are inherently critical. Are all hate studies critical hate studies? Because there's no point in applying a label of critical if it encompasses the whole of the discipline. It doesn't really add anything then. And as already mentioned, hate studies was created at a time when various critical endeavours had already been pursued for 2 or 3 decades and had already permeated the disciplines from which hate studies was constructed. So in this context, the critical has always been present to some extent. There's no point within hate studies at which a critical turn has taken place, I don't think. And in fact, it may even be seen as a product of critical turns within other disciplines. So, are all hate studies critical? We could argue yes. And if I kind of reflect on my current position within a law school that has a more traditional background, then hate studies does appear critical. It's different from the traditional doctrinal legal methodology where the law is approached as a coherent and rational system, and the purpose of research is to identify the rules and the principles that make it make sense, or are supposed to make it make sense. So doctrinal research doesn't really have any concern for social realities or systems beyond the letter of the law. So in a law department such as this, although it is getting increasingly critical through excellent new hires, in such law departments, anything socio-legal or any analysis of power could be labelled as critical. And of course, addressing social realities and sticking up for those who are unduly marginalised is what hate studies is generally all about. So from that perspective, hate studies would seem to be a critical area of legal research, perhaps. But I think the more fruitful distinction might be found in the distinction between criminology and critical criminology. I think that might be a more helpful place to look to. So here the label critical entails at least a degree of skepticism towards law's ability to remedy hatreds, and at least an openness to considering the ways in which law can perpetrate various harms. And I hope you agree with me there, as I'm very aware that I'm talking to a room of criminologists, people with more background in criminology than I have. So I would argue that there is a significant portion of hate studies that doesn't necessarily fit that critical criminology definition. And that's kind of where I'm interested in drawing a distinction. So I propose that the label of critical could most helpfully be applied to distinguish the more radical and rupturing and reimagining scholarship from that which seeks to justify and reform the current system. Now, I'm aware of the possibility here that applying critical in this way might seem to reserve the term for what could be seen as abstract or perhaps pure theory academic pursuits. And indeed, perhaps this could be viewed as maybe even useful for segregating a corner of hate studies that practitioners don't need to concern themselves with. And shouldn't all critical approaches be about dismantling boundaries and borders rather than creating them? Well, I don't think there's any need to see disciplinary borders as rigid or necessarily alienating here. For example, we know that campaigning around particular identities can bring people together, increase visibility, increase understanding of difference. So perhaps the same could be true for identifying a subdiscipline of critical hate studies. It might facilitate conversation and collaboration between like-minded scholars and practitioners. It might increase the visibility of critical perspectives within hate studies. And perhaps it could help us to move beyond the caveat that I always feel I need to give. Yes, I take a critical approach to hate crime law, but no, I don't think it should be repealed. And yes, I do take the harms caused by hatred seriously. So I think the critical hate studies should involve critiques that rupture and reimagine, but I also have some other ideas about what this entails. I think some of the foundations of critical theory need to be kind of foregrounded here, so that critical scholarship should be emancipatory, it should be egalitarian, and then I think abolitionist and utopian perspectives are also useful. And to be honest, this is where I've got a lot of reading yet to do around abolitionism and utopian methodologies, prefigurative politics, etc. I want to develop this further. And I also want to make the point that critical studies can sometimes be viewed as something that is negative and disparaging. But I want to frame it instead as something that opens up new possibilities. And I like to think that this doesn't exclude practitioners, but perhaps there are more conversations to be had about how to actively include them and their concerns within critical strands of hate studies. The practical impact is still very important to me. I'm taking a long time to get there with my own research, but it's a direction that I'm consciously heading in. And to this end, I find the concept of non-reformist reforms that's developed in abolitionist literature to be highly relevant. So this is the idea that it's not feasible to burn it all down and start again. We might have our ideas of a utopia where hate crime is not necessary because there is no hatred or there is no problematic expression of hatred. But what we're thinking about in the present is what we do have the power to change about our current reality. So we keep the utopian big picture in mind as we think about what we can change here and now.
10 minutes, please, Jen. 10 minutes.
Oh, no problem. I don't think I'll be that long. Thank you. So how can we advocate reforms not with the aim of improving the system, of making it more efficient in its own terms, but with the aim of transforming the system and leading us towards utopian end goals? How do we do hate studies in ways that lead us towards a world without hate? So this is how I'm trying to bring together the different disciplinary circles within which I move, and also how I'm trying to cling to hope and optimism in what can be very dark and depressing areas of study. Now, maybe I'm just trying to justify where I've ended up so far in life, but I think and I hope that this will speak to others, because I recognise these kinds of what I like to label critical hate studies approaches in other people's work from time to time. And I'd like critical hate studies to be a label that enables me to find and encourage and improve the reach of more of that work. But there we go. What do you think? I'm very aware that, as I said, this is my view that comes from my disciplinary background, and in the ethos of critical studies, no one person can really impose this. I wouldn't wish to impose it, but I'd really like to start a conversation. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for illustrating and breaching some of the boundaries between law and criminology and hate studies. Thank you very much for that. Before I invite questions, which I will do in a moment, being the chair, I have the privilege of asking the first question. With the recent Law Commission, well, say recent, it was around 3 years ago now that the Law Commission reported that there should be some change to hate crime legislation in the UK. It was that in the view of legal, critical legal studies and in the view of critical criminology, did that serve its purpose? Or, as critical criminologists might say, typical? The government has done nothing with the information supplied by the Law Commission, as we thought they wouldn't, because power is overarching here. So how does critical legal studies, as well as critical criminology, view the Law Commission's output and what the government has done with that, which is not much?
Thank you, David. So I think there are some recommendations in the Law Commission's report that are practical improvements. So as I mentioned, I focus on the stirring up hatred offences, and for example, they recommended that the threshold for stirring up racial hatred and stirring up religious hatred should be the same. And that makes sense. It should always have been the same. It was a complete kind of self-defeating compromise that it was ever not the same. So the recommendation to equalise that, yeah, that is a kind of easy fix or easy win. But in other respects, I think, and again, I'm focusing on kind of the construction of identity categories, and I think the Law Commission hasn't always got it right in